Right. Kick it off.
Right. So I had a thought this morning as I was out social distancing in the neighborhood that maybe we could start by, we have various acquaintances with Tocqueville, some of old and some relatively new. So if you were to think about his argument overall, not talking about any particular pieces, I'm just trying to get a sense of your feeling of your relationship with Tocqueville. And I had three categories that I'm going to put out there and ask you to stick to one of these three categories. Based on your understanding and acquaintance with Alexis, would you consider him to be a friend? By that, I mean someone who wants what's good for us and who desires connection. Would you consider him to be a critic, someone who's interested in academic analysis in theoretical terms and we can take it or leave it? Or would you consider him to be a stranger, who's someone who's alien to us in his intent and maybe an aristocrat in disguise? So as we go around and introduce ourselves, if you would just say, I consider Alexis to be friend, critic, or stranger. And you might just say one or two sentences as to why. Now I have a caveat. I'm gonna let you think about that for a minute, and I have a caveat. Then the point of our subsequent discussion, and believe me, I'm one of the more contentious people in symposium that you'll ever run into, will not be to prove our point of view that he is either a friend, critic, or stranger. That's not the point. I just want to get a sense of your initial feeling about Alexis and why you might feel that way, and just by way of getting a sense of where we are all coming from, as they say, in this virtual way. So, however, you want to do it alphabetically, Andy, and guess who goes first?
I guess that would be me then. I would say that he says in his text, at this time, he even would worship it right now. So equality at that point in time. And so I would say he's a friend of it, but he's not going to be a blind friend. He's going to try to look at it carefully and say, here's what I think, why I think this is the greatest good, the greatest philosophical good for the benefit of mankind. But I'm also, I'm going to point out what I think are the dangers and the shortcomings about it. So I think it's an honest friend.
An honest friend.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just going alphabetically. It would be Granny Joanne on my screen.
Not Dave. Okay.
Yeah. So Joanne.
Or Diane.
Are you there, Joanne?
I was going to say, is Dave?
Yeah, we'll come back. Yeah, Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd say de Tocqueville is all three. I think primarily he's wants to be a friend, someone who really appreciates what we have, what the democracies have to offer, especially the United States. But I think he's also a critic in that he sees what could go wrong and warns about them. And last, I think there's a little bit of a stranger there too, which kind of surprised me. I mean, my last acquaintance was half a century ago.
Yeah.
But it looks like, yes, there is a little bit of the aristocrat left there, and certainly an awful lot of the upper middle class. Traditionally, the traditional upper middle class. And I think that's at least in part because that's who he met when he did his travels in America, which I think are more described in Volume 1.
Okay, thanks, Dave.
Why don't we just go down the screen? Tom, would you mind going next?
Yeah.
Sure. So I think he's a friend, and I think that because I think he has the same intellectual tradition that I do and the same set of values and the same interest, and I have a great deal of respect for that and of his I think the context that he's operating in is the best possible context. And so even though he doesn't know us in the same way that we know ourselves, I think of him as a deep friend.
Thanks. Good.
Diane?
Yeah, I guess I would say a friend. I really saw him as an early political scientist. I mean, and then it was so biased by his aristocratic point of view. So I think he became a friend as he looked into this, but he also had a lot of arrogance. There were a lot of things that were like sweeping assumptions, and I was like,
Yes.
where did he come up with this? You know, like his comments on the father-son relationship and whatever. So there was an arrogance to it sometimes. But I think overall, yes, he was an advocate for democracy, and an advocate for what we were doing here. But he spoke to it as an aristocrat trying to influence his own society, I think.
Okay. Thanks, Dan.
Marilyn, do you want to comment? I know you haven't maybe read it as much as you would have liked, but.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'd have to vote for stranger. At least to me. No, I am in the unread pool. But delighted to be here to observe my very first meeting with you guys.
Great. Adele.
I felt like a sense of recognition when I would read certain parts and feel like a kin spirit to what he was saying and thinking and what I had sort of experienced in my own life as far as democracy goes, and since I've traveled a lot and I've seen other systems, political systems, I can say that I really am very much aware of how democracy works or sometimes doesn't work, and the problems that we may have that we can get into with equality, or how equality is interpreted in our society. But I saw him as a friend and as a critic who pointed us sort of to some significant truths, because he didn't just stop at making one statement. As far as feeling that he was a stranger, the times I felt some distance or that he was a little bit too aristocratic, I sort of wrote off as someone who is distant from us time-wise, and of course conditioned by his own um, place in society, and that was all right, because that's, every one of us can be judged by that later in time, and at least he bothered to do this, and I think did a good job. And I think his emphasis on the fact that democracy is, liberty is extremely important, and that we can lose easily, really I really connected with that. And the other thing that he emphasized is that education is extremely important, and not only are we doing that right now, but it makes all the difference. It means we're thinking about these issues, and very often we don't think about them, and that's why sometimes we have political leaders that are maybe not the best for our whole society, and yet people follow them blindly. So I think it's great for just material to think about and expose ourselves to. So a friend and a
Thanks,
critic.
Adele. We can conjure you up even though you don't appear on the screen.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
We can conjure up your smiling face.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Francine, you want to go?
Yeah, are you asking the question, our concept of how he approached democracy or America? Because I thought he was a friend to democracy. I mean, I seem to be a big proponent, but I thought he was something of a critic and a stranger to America. And I question sometimes his observations of America.
Okay, that's an interesting distinction, right?
Steve?
So I was introduced to Tocqueville when I was up at school at UC Santa Cruz, and I had a professor who just, this was back in the 70s. And I think one of the things that I was always impressed by, and I felt in certain ways having a fresh set of eyes to come to America, this sense of coming from outside and seeing us with a new set of eyes, I think in some ways offered a view into America that perhaps America didn't have to itself. Just, you know, we take a lot for granted in growing up here and participating in education and our local civic groups and all of this. And I think that having de Tocqueville's fresh eyes can do that. So in some ways, I think it's those eyes that he was intending to come, I think, as an analyst to look at how we were doing our prisons and seeing what parallels or what lessons could be taught to France when he returned. And yet I think he stumbled on so many other things that he began to do a deeper analysis and all of a sudden started seeing some things that he could certainly bring back to his home country. And I think in some ways, even though he came in with this level of analysis, he, I think, was frequently surprised and wanted to bring back certain lessons that he learned and kind of longed for those in his home country. And I think that was the whole aristocratic side that he is a very strong, I think he's a critic of it. He talks about the limits that aristocracy has on trying to provide equality, on trying to provide liberties. And I think in that sense, he, I think, became more of a friend to what we were doing in America and wanted to share some of those lessons with his home country.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Ray.
Thanks, Steve.
Ray, do you want to go?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I appreciate all the thoughtful comments so far. I think I'd see him as a critical friend. In the author's preface, he mentions that men will not receive the truth from their enemies, and it is very seldom offered to them by their friends. And I think his primary audience was French, and he needed to meet them where they are. And that's where I saw the aristocratic arguments coming on as a matter of persuasion. But there are these times that his passion came out in his advocacy for democracy, as I think had been noted, in just some word choices, which made me kind of conclude and sense him as a friend, but a critical friend because of his audience.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Joanne, were you able to plug in? And I see your face.
Hi.
Hi. Great. It's so beautiful over there.
It is. I decided outside was the place to be.
Yeah, it's great. So what do you think?
I agree with the critical friend. I think the objective view that Steve was talking about is a plus and a minus. It is nice to have fresh eyes and see things that we don't necessarily see ourselves. But I think there was also the broad strokes that he painted were pretty general, and you thought, who is he talking to, and what kind of a basis does he have for making some of these statements? Mm-hmm. I felt like he was pretty well disposed to democracy, but like us, he shares some of the concerns of issues that could arise and problems that could happen. And he seemed pretty prescient because we see a lot of those things in actuality now. Mm-hmm. But I appreciated his, I guess, more objective outside view.
Mm-hmm. Paula, did you ever make it in?
Thanks, John.
Paula, are you there? It seems like she's connected, but I'm not hearing anything.
Maybe on mute. I can see the little mute button.
Yeah, she is on mute.
Paul, are you there? Because I'm seeing there's two Paulas. One is called in and one is on the computer.
Yeah. Looks like they're both unmuted right now, but
Right.
Maybe she doesn't have a mic or something.
Yeah, maybe so. Well, let's continue, Carl.
Okay, well, thanks for that. I think that's we have a good sense now of not necessarily a vote around the circle, but I think we have a good sense of maybe his perspective and then how we see him ourselves. And sometimes we could see him as, well, he was doing this in the 19th century, and what about that, and et cetera. Or we could also see him as speaking to us today. And then we could make certain judgments, as you all seem to have done, about what he has to say to us today and what seems to be on point and what seems to be dated or not as relevant or not as accurate in his observation. So let's just keep those background thoughts in mind, and then jump into it. One of the topics that I see coming up over and over again is the role of religion. And I always liked, if we're having these seminars at Thomas Aquinas College, I'm seeing myself there now and saying, what about the role of religion? Because he seems, coming from France, he seems to have a perspective that he's bringing to this largely Protestant country. So I was just curious about your various perspectives there, if you have any particular citations or overall observations you'd like to make about Tocqueville's use of how he saw the role of religion.
Well, I have one that I just was reviewing things this morning that caught my attention. It's on page 23.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a pretty good reflection of where our society is today. It's at the bottom of the page, and I'm starting in the middle of a sentence. In a state of society, it's about 9 lines up.
Mm-hmm.
In a state of society where men are broken up into very unequal ranks, they are apt to devise as many deities as there are nations, castes, classes, and families, and to trace 1,000 private roads to heaven. To me, that's where our society is today. With that's not where we were at the time he was traveling through the U.S. That caught my attention.
Well, I'm just, in terms of that quote, and I'm not sure which translation you're using or volume you're using.
The same book.
Okay.
Yeah. This one right here, Carl? This cover?
This one?
Yeah.
And then on the same, above on the same page at the end of the first paragraph, he says, the circle within they wish to restrict the human intellect ought therefore to be very carefully traced, and beyond its verge, the mind should be left entirely free to its own guidance.
Right.
I mean, in those quotes, he's reinforcing the independence and freedom of the American mind. So I don't know if that, you may have been trying to get to a different point about religion, but that was what struck me was.
No, I want to support what you're saying. It seems to me that this chapter and the chapter just prior to it, speaking about independence, that there's a very strong feeling for the American that he's not going to be talked out of wanting riches, but what he can be persuaded about is getting them honestly. But then, and well persuaded, but in general, life is sort of grounded here, and it's there's very much that you're looking to your own lights to guide your activity, which is, I thought your point, Diane, was it reinforced the religious feeling is not going to be in the way like the Catholic experience is more acquiescing to authority. There's much less of that. It's you're deciding for yourself how it's going.
Yeah, particularly today when there's so much, is this a Christian nation or is it not a Christian nation? And these quotes allude to an evolution from that.
I thought it was very interesting that both in the beginning of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 5, he essentially says, those who believe in equality also seem to believe in dogmatic belief. They believe in dogma. That they go elsewhere for answers rather than dreaming them up themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's interesting. So that's contrary then.
A little bit.
But the source, what about the source of belief though in religion? If we're right in saying that Americans are skeptical about accepting authority that's beyond themselves, and that would seem to suggest a providence or the divine, then what's the source of authority in religion, in democracy?
Seem to point to the fact that when we have all this equality, we're not worried about the next world and promises of pie in the sky by and by.
Mm-hmm.
We're worried about now and what we have here and now in this life.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I agree.
And I think he also brings that up again in relation to, you know, in the very beginning when he's talking about, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but if I remember right, he talks about, you know, we are not built on, at least in America, we're not built on the idea of forms and philosophy, but instead the practical reality of what we can find, that, you know, what we can get immediate returns on. And I think he then ties that back into religion, because he said, in some ways, if you go back to Europe, a lot of that is built on just this acceptance of the deity, the acceptance of kind of religious foundations. Whereas in America, I think I thought what he was saying is that there is kind of the more practical side of religion too, that we can, even though it may be built on this other world or this going to the next life, it is more about the practical, more immediate returns of religion, community, and kind of being together and doing good works with each other. That was kind of the take I took, as well as just that feeling of kind of the more practical side.
Well, I'm looking at page 26, and what it said to me is, and I'm looking down at the bottom of the page, the second to the last paragraph, the last full paragraph, the second line, the more the conditions of men are equalized, which he kept talking about the importance of equality in America, and assimilated to each other, the more important is it for religion, while it carefully abstains from the daily turmoil of secular affairs, not needlessly to run counter to the ideas that generally prevail or to the permanent interests that exist to the mass of people. I thought he kept talking about we take care of ourselves, we have this equality, we're out there. And remember, this was 1840, so I saw this as he was looking at a nation that was out there building the nation. And he saw religion as it stayed away from the importance of tilling the ground, and took it more to this is the dogmatic beliefs that we all held. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Question. What does
go
he
ahead.
mean by forms?
What's that?
What does he mean by forms? That was your question?
Yes.
He uses that, like I was trying to look through that in later parts, but I don't think he means Platonic forms as much as sort of like customs or ways of doing things.
Symbols.
That's the impression I got.
Symbols.
Customs.
Yeah, customs. But so Francine, on the next page on 27 at the top, I was thinking that it's the second line on 27. In America, religion is a distinct sphere in which the priest is sovereign, but out of which he takes care never to go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I see. He left, and that is exactly what happened in the country, didn't it? And we had the pioneers were going across the country. They were worried about tilling the land and growing the crops, and taking care of building the country. They were building the country, and the religion just followed, and they had a different, they just said it had a different aspect to it. And that's what I thought, he kept it separate. But he never talked about the importance how we separated church and state.
I thought what you were implying, though, was that in that line and what you said earlier, that you say, well, obviously caring about religion is important, but we're not a theocracy, right? So it's not, so our belief in God is not going to decide our society. And it works for everything that it doesn't work for. So in other words, you can believe whatever you want to believe, but there's a way about being in society that, in a way, it trumps it seems to me in some ways, and they can coexist as long as they don't conflict.
Seemed
I
almost
agree. And I think that's what he was looking at, because we had this aren't we, I mean, France didn't have the separation of church and state. And that's why I asked at the beginning, who are the other democratic nations? And it was just France. And France has always supported the church. So it's like, it was a respect for the separation of church and state.
it seemed to me almost like a separation of church and daily life.
Right.
Go ahead and believe what you want as long as it doesn't impact what you do.
Because I think in those days, their daily life was just survival.
Well, probably not for everybody.
They're wanting comfort. They're striving for their own comfort too. He says a lot about that. So it's not just survival. It seems to me they're trying to have a good life.
Well, define comfort in those days. Think a Little House on the Prairie.
But Little House on the Prairie was not the common experience. The common experience was a lot more like New England or Maryland, where agriculture was very established, where technology was rampant. So it was a different life other than out on the plains. Very
Well, therein lies the problem with this book. What part of America is he looking at in those days?
Talking to.
Well, first of all, in 1840, we weren't settling the plains yet, were we?
Yes, we were. Yes, we were.
Were we? Okay.
Well, they weren't in the plains, but the west was. He went out to they said how far he went west. He went as far west as the country existed.
But it seems to me you could avoid this difficulty possibly just by saying that we're generally a Protestant nation, but that the way that we hold religion in a kind of a certain circle, it seems to me you could say that now. So even if he said, well, I'm not on the plains, or I've only stayed in New England or whatever, it seems to me he's on to something, which is we're religious, and the majority of us are religious, but we're religious in a kind of a particular way that Europe wasn't.
Well, could I interject?
I agree.
Let me interject here, since we mentioned Protestantism, since we live in a hotbed of radical Protestantism today, not in the 1840s, but where we live. The question would be, could an American minister, Protestant minister, we're not talking about the priest here, but could an American minister preach a sermon every Sunday that basically said, give up all you have, just repeat what Jesus said, by the way, just give up all your goods to the poor, take up your cross and follow me. And if that were his sermon every Sunday, how would that be received, given the fact that since we're in the same chapter on page 26, it says the taste for well-being is a prominent and indelible feature of democratic times.
Right.
Okay, so we could say, well, that doesn't seem to be time-bound. If you live in democratic times, he's saying the taste for physical well-being is a prominent, indelible feature of democratic times.
Right.
So if the role of religion then is to lift people above that by quoting the founder of Christianity, if one wants to say that was Jesus versus Paul, let's say, if the founder of Christianity says, give up all your worldly goods to the poor, take up your cross and follow me, what kind of following is that Protestant minister going to have?
Right.
On that same page, Karl, where he says, this is in the second to last paragraph, men cannot be cured of the love of riches,
yes, exactly.
but they may be persuaded to enrich themselves by none but honest means.
Yes.
So it is kind of a tempering of Jesus's message there.
Tom, what are you going to say?
Yeah, well, I wanted to say, in relation to the question, what part of America is he talking about? It seems to me he's rather talking about what is the effect of equality on American life and experience. So that the comparison that's being made isn't this part of America in any particular way. It's that there is in America this equality that is unique and new at that time, at least. and that he wants us to look at, well, what are the effects of that equality in a general sense? What does that do to people? How does it make them different? And he gives us all sorts of examples. And then now what about religion?
Yeah, one thing I was struck by, him coming from Europe where the church, was integral into the government structures there, that he, you talk about Jesus's message, but the message of the Catholic Church was not give to the poor, it was give to the church. And I just didn't see, I don't remember him talking about the organization of the church and religion versus religion as an individual experience. He seemed to focus more on the individual aspect of and to me, there's a dramatic difference as to how religion played out in Europe and how religion plays out here. But I didn't hear him do the compare and contrast. It was more just speaking to religion as being, to me, it was more like an individual experience that informed how people operate in our society.
So page 27. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Who did I interrupt?
Oh, okay. This is just an introduction about France. I thought that the French Revolution, took away that union between the church and the state in France, and that the French were very anti-clerical. They, to this date they are. So I'm not sure about, that aspect of him. But the really interesting thing to me that caught my attention was, and it's so much like now, this is in chapter 9, book, I forget which book, I'm reading the Gutenberg one, to touch their congregations, talking about the ministers, they always allow them, they always show them how favorable religious opinions are to freedom and public tranquility.
Yeah.
And it is often difficult to ascertain from their discourses whether the principal object of religion is to procure eternal felicity in the other world or prosperity in this.
Yes.
This makes me think of the prosperity churches. And I was thinking that is right on for today.
No, I think that I'm really glad you pointed that out. I was going to go back, stay on page 27, which is still in chapter 3 or chapter 5 rather. And just it's the same thing as you just read, though, in a different way. It's 3 paragraphs from the bottom, or 2. It's kind of to Karl's question. The American ministers of the gospel do not attempt to draw or to fix all the thoughts of man upon the life to come. They are willing to surrender a portion of his heart to the cares of the present, seeming to consider the goods of this world as important, though secondary objects. So again, like what Karl said is, if the minister said to you, drop everything and follow Christ, that's, in my view, antithetical to the American spirit or what's being advocated, right? Which is kind of what Steve was also saying.
Which he says is a function of equality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But as a result of having this equality, we get this characteristic. We get this sort of American mind, which is different than the European mind that he's accustomed to.
That seeking your well-being is a good thing, right? I mean, that's kind of what you're saying in other words, it seems to me. One aspect is thinking that your well-being is a good thing. Another is thinking that you can figure things out yourself. You're less inclined to accept dogma, I think he's saying. You think this is more your business than to be told how this is. Yeah.
Well, the other thing is our clergy, I mean, when they talk about this, they were not being supported by the state. The clergy that he's talking about and he's observing was all voluntary, that the people had to support the clergy, not the state, which in France, the state supports the religion. So that had to have a big...
That's not true. That isn't true after the French Revolution.
Also, Germany currently supports the church from state funds.
Sorry?
In
No,
fact,
no, I was talking about
modern day
France.
Germany does.
Yeah,
I'm
but
saying that
even though the French Revolution occurred, he was coming from the aristocracy, and this is only 40 or 50 years after the revolution. So you still have those impulses, I think, within the social structure over there. You know.
But I was
Well,
going to
I
go
just
back to
don't know.
I was going to go back to a point that Tom made about equality, which is obviously sort of the underlying theme here. What does he see as the connection between equality and God's will? Going back to the religious aspect, what does he see as the connection between equality and God's will?
Wow.
Prosperity and God's will.
Well, I'm thinking equality is linked to prosperity. I'm trying to get to the fundamental question that Tom's pointing to is how he looks at equality and equality of conditions as driving a lot of the other kind of epic phenomena we're talking about, like the taste for physical well-being. But the fundamental question would be, where does Tocqueville see God in all of this from the standpoint of, does God think equality is just, for instance?
Well, on page 334, which is the end of the book, if that's okay, Karl, 5 lines from the bottom. Providence has not created mankind entirely independent or entirely free. It is true that around every man a fatal circle is traced beyond which he cannot pass. But within the wide verge of that circle, he is powerful and free, and it is with man, so with communities. The nations of our time cannot prevent the conditions of men from becoming equal, but it depends upon themselves, etc.
Yeah, so God has mandated the equality. It's providential. This is irresistible.
I think so.
But I was looking at the top of page 333.
Okay.
We may naturally believe that it is not the singular prosperity. So the first paragraph from top of page 333 in the chapter called The General Survey of the Subject.
Yep.
We may naturally believe that it is not the singular prosperity of the few, but the greater well-being of all, that is the most pleasing in the sight of the Creator and preserver of men.
Yep.
What appears to me to be man's decline is, in his eye, advancement. See, that's interesting. De Tocqueville's making the distinction between what he sees as man's decline and what God sees. What afflicts me is acceptable to him. The state of equality is perhaps less elevated, but it is more just.
Yep.
And its justice constitutes its greatness and its beauty. I mean, that's a pretty foundational claim on this part about God's view. And the question is, would we think less of God if he didn't think equality was just?
Well, we probably would.
We'd have a problem with that, wouldn't we?
Yeah, we would. But, going back to an earlier chapter and on page 23, I think he's making an important distinction here, even though he might be wrong about he may be dated in thinking that this wouldn't last. I'm looking at the paragraph on page 23. I'm looking at the paragraph that starts with Muhammad professed to derive from heaven and has inserted in the Quran not only religious doctrines, but political maxims, civil and criminal laws, and theories of science. The gospel, on the contrary, speaks only of the general relations of men to God and to each other, which is interesting because he is saying there's an aspect of hands off, whereas in the Quran, everything is prescribed. And he's saying that might not last. And I guess I was wondering if people feel that that's true, because in many ways, a lot of societies that still follow the Quran tend to be a little bit more repressive, because they are involved in the civil and criminal laws.
Right. There's no separation of church and state.
Right.
So, I mean, so Adele, wouldn't you say that a free people, or people who are striving for liberty and equality, they can't have a prescribed religion that's going to delve into all of those political matters?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it speaks only of the general relations of men to God and to each other. So there's some morality, there's morality there, but it's not as restrictive.
Otherwise, the church would just be a different form of aristocracy.
Right. That's right.
Well, what I haven't heard anybody talk about necessarily is the power of majority opinion and how that derives from equality. But that seems to be pretty fundamental to what he sees as one of the dangers in democracy, is the power of the majority, even though we would say, well, of course, the majority rules in all cases, and how can that be wrong? So I think it's that question of, and that relates to religion as much as it relates to politics.
But majority doesn't mean majority of those who are alive. It just means selected group that either has the rights to vote or is active in government. So it's a selected majority, because I mean, in America, you don't have everyone voting, so we're not talking about the majority, are we?
Dave?
I was struck by several things he does in there. One is, there's no mention of the Second Great Awakening. So in the United States, there was this fervor of religious fervor that lasts, from certainly the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. You've also got the Jacksonian Revolution in politics. So there's a lot of things going on in the United States that he doesn't mention, slavery being one of them. But I'm very confused with his seeming to, I don't know whether he's emphasizing religion or denigrating it by saying it's dogmatic now and it's not important, so nobody worries about it. But that seems to be his message.
There is one chapter on fanatical enthusiasm, excuse me, about the camp meetings. Excuse me.
There's also,
chapter 12.
He writes about slavery, just not in what we selected today.
Yes.
Right. See, I guess what I thought Karl was trying to ask was, it's on our page 10, which is Sources of Belief in Democracies. One thing we might wonder about, and it's about 20 lines from the top on page 10. At periods of equality, men have no faith in one another by reason of their common resemblance, but this very resemblance gives them almost unbounded confidence in the judgment of the public. For it would seem probable that, as they are all endowed with equal means of judging, the greater truth should go with the greater number. So it seems to me what you were asking was, not just we're going to go with the greater number, but that the greater truth should go with the greater number, that we have a confidence in that. So that seems to me, that's diverges from aristocracy and also religion in a kind of a fundamental way.
And yet our Constitution attempts to protect the minority.
It does.
From the majority. So the majority is not always right.
No, you're right. The Constitution does do that.
Right, and he talks about the judicial power having a role to play in protecting minority rights as well as freedom of the press.
Right.
So he's aware that in the United States there are protections for minority rights, but the overwhelming influence of the majority, I mean, I think we could see it every day. Why do we have opinion polls? Right. And why do we put so much stock in opinion polls? When you have surveys of 1,000 people that are, quote, representative samples according to the experts, and we're supposed to put stock in those as opposed to what we might say makes more sense, is not necessarily what we find in opinion polls. Should we live our lives according to opinion polls? Well, he today would probably say, well, you might want to think about that.
Mm-hmm.
Or Mark Twain, you might say, if you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to re-examine your opinion.
Who was it that said, if you follow the majority, you lose half of your intelligence?
Sounds like Twain, but I'm not sure.
Well,
Steve, what were you going to say?
I thought what he was saying on page 10 was in the old system before democracy and equality.
Okay.
People listened to those of superior intelligence, supposedly, those of the higher, the aristocracy.
Mm-hmm.
We might think of those as experts in our world today. But that as we gather equality, we stop thinking that those are the people who know better than we do, but the common opinion becomes extremely influential.
Yeah.
In a society that has equality, what the common opinion is becomes a very powerful thing.
Yeah.
And that seems to me a profoundly interesting observation, and one that is correct. I'm not quite sure where that goes, but it seems to me we can see that in our world today, that we are influenced by the media, for example.
Right.
If I ask you why you think something, and you're honest, you'll say, well, I saw a movie that showed that's what France looked like in 1910, or I read a book somewhere, or I heard on television somebody's opinion. So the way we shape opinion is or the way that we understand things is based on our understanding of the common view.
And that's what advertisement really tries to appeal to.
Right.
I was gonna.
Yes, Steve.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think, and I was trying to find the page, but I do remember him saying something about kind of the warnings about that majority opinion, and that does sway, and that we do need to make sure that there are some safeguards against following that majority. I remember when he was reviewing the Constitution, and he was impressed by the fact that it wasn't direct vote for the Senate, that at that time, it was the electors who were doing the Senate. It was the judges who had independence. And there was some of that separation involved to guard against the tyranny of the majority. I couldn't find exactly where he said that, but I do remember him warning us a bit about that the sway of the majority and the worries about that, like you were saying, the public opinion polls and some of that it can often have consequences that we were not really looking forward to. So,
go ahead. Whoever it was.
Steve, I appreciate that. I just wanted to, in terms of that views that we have today, I was going to look at his chapter specifically on equality of the sexes, and nobody's brought those up yet. So I thought we might move to those because there's an area where we definitely have views today that might be at odds with his, and that could be because he comes from aristocracy, or he was writing when he was writing. But I'd just be interested to see what you thought of the education of young women in America and the notion of how Americans understand the equality of the sexes.
I thought it was very dated.
You think?
Well, good. How so?
Well, the woman's place was in the home, and the man was the one that had all the outside goings and all the outside business activities, and the woman was supposed to be meek and humble and in the, barefoot and in the kitchen, barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen. I thought it was very dated.
Well, the division of labor was so clearly delineated. What was women's and what was men's. And even though they kind of respected a woman's opinion, it just didn't translate into her getting into the marketplace.
But the women were out in the fields working, and our founding fathers, I'm the famous one that always says the only reason the founding fathers could go do what they needed to do is because the women were running the plantations. So the women were back there working.
Well, remember what he says. He's to me, I would argue it's dated and not dated. And the reason why I say that is that he will say in chapter 12, end of chapter 12, he'll say that, to your point, Francine, I think, if I were asked now that I am drawing to the close of this work, in which I have spoken of so many important things, I'm on page 214, done by the Americans, in what the singular prosperity and growing strength of the people ought mainly to be attributed, I should reply to the superiority of their women. So it doesn't seem to me he's saying, here's where I would say it's not dated. He seems to be saying that we're not going to pretend that women don't have desires or interest, heart or mind, but what we're going to do is basically educate them the way we educate men, to say, you're going to be consequence focused. You're going to think about the consequences. We're not going to pretend to train you out of desire or being unvirtuous. So I would say that part actually I thought was sort of really interesting. And of course the other part is when he says, the dated part is, well, men have their particular purview and women have their particular purview. That's not what we generally believe now. We want to say people can do all kinds of things together. They're not different, but I wouldn't say it's just dated, I guess. Ray, go ahead.
I was going to say on that point, I agree on both sides. I mean, I think, yes, clearly in terms of the social descriptions and social functions, he was dated in terms of today. I mean, that's clear. But then when he does talk about that we've done all we can in America to raise morally and intellectually to the level of man, and the education is compared to Europe, I found that distinction interesting too, because he talks about how in Europe women are basically objects and that they are complimented, but we don't compliment them in America. So I did sense, in looking at the words in the paragraphs, of fundamental respect and esteem. Even looking at the education piece, I said to myself, wow, I'd be surprised if some American historians looked at the education level of women as being independent and morally superior. I bet we could take some comparable American writers and not have the level of respect that he had as women as fundamental creatures, human beings, not their social dictates.
Yeah.
Was not talking about Abigail Adams and Dolly Madison. I mean, there were women who were the power behind the throne, much more than what he describes.
For sure.
Well, again, I one of the things that I go back to is I kind of keep thinking about him and his context coming from Europe, and all of a sudden seeing American women at least being able to speak more overtly than they had in Europe. Again, your point, Ray, about they were seen as objects in Europe. I think it's a step in the right direction. I'm not saying he was there, but it certainly is something where he's recognizing that at the very least, women have the capacity, the intellectual capacity to speak up, to be able to be heard. I'm not saying that it was there yet, but he's definite. Relative to where he came from in Europe and France specifically, he is seeing huge leaps for females in American society. But I saw the separation. Again, I saw, they talk about the physical labor out in the fields. There's no way a woman could do some of the, and yet again, there were some dated pieces in there, but at the same time, I thought what was kind of strange though is to bring up the whole thing about rape as still being so, all of a sudden it's like, and then he talks about it in Europe, that it's rare that in a capital, that it would have ever been considered a capital offense. And in most cases, if a man raped a woman in Europe, the reality is he would never be convicted. It was one of those things. I was surprised about that. Again, not anyway.
Well, there's a passage on 211 I'd like to point out to see if this sounds familiar. And he is referring to Europe in this point. It's the second paragraph. There are people in Europe who, confounding together the different characteristics of the sexes, would make man and woman into beings not only equal, but alike. They would give to both the same functions, impose on them the same duties, and grant to them the same rights. They would mix them in all things, their occupations, their pleasures, their business. may be readily conceived that by thus attempting to make one sex equal to the other, both are degraded. And from so preposterous a medley of the works of nature, nothing could ever result but weak men and disorderly women.
So who are those people in Europe? Where does that come from?
That sounds like us, doesn't it?
I was thinking the same thing. That sounds like today.
It sounds like today.
That's the debate today, right? We're trying to find the place where we're equal but not the same. Yeah.
But I don't think our goal is to have weak men and disorderly women.
No,
I think our goal is to raise all boats, not bring everybody to a lowest common denominator.
Exactly.
I agree, but there are people who say our men are becoming weaker because our women are Amazon women.
You're right.
There are, yeah.
So the point being, he does recognize that what's, just as we've been saying, he's got this European perspective, but he does see something very different, as Steve was saying. It's something very different in America, and the superiority of the women, in part due, as Ray was saying, to their education.
Yeah.
We approach the education of women differently than in Europe. But he does recognize there's also the radical view that there's no difference between the sexes. And, there are those who would argue that that's the view that we've adopted. And the interesting question is, how do we get, and I'm not talking about historically, I'm talking about conceptually, how do we get from the view that he talks about in terms of division of labor to the view that he seems to be hitting square the nail on the head here in terms of sexual equality? There's no difference in the sexes. They're not only equal, but they're alike.
But he's not saying that. He's saying that there are people in Europe who are. I think he's putting that out there as a false argument to build his other argument. He's not agreeing with that, is he?
But he wouldn't say we wouldn't say that's a false argument today. Forget about whether it's in Europe, but just the way that's being read right there, what he's saying is man and woman into beings not only equal but alike. So how can there be any differences respected in law, for instance, that would treat men and women differently? How do we get to that?
Well, so Karl, wouldn't you say, it seems to me, I'm trying to find the line, but he's saying something like, what equality and liberty do is create the situation where women have to be educated, right? And have to have this kind of a standing. It's the situation that they have to go under their own guidance from a very early age, which I think we get, that's true. So not having an aristocracy then puts women in some kind of jeopardy in that sense. But then it seems to me equality fully manifested more, then you would have to ask the questions like, well, obviously there's biological differences, but does that translate into, let's say, one's better at law than another? And we know the answer to that is no, right? So then it seems like it's the natural extension of thinking about equality. Is that kind of like what you're asking?
Yeah, it seems to me is what he's going back to, as Tom was saying, equality is the feature here that he's focusing on.
Yeah.
And how we got there would be, once you've admitted that equality is the basic right of everyone, you can't maintain differences related to sex or gender. It just won't stand up.
I'm always struck by when we read these documents, this is 1840 or whatever. I mean, we're still struggling with these issues. He's suggesting the struggle, and here we are, 200 years later, and we're still struggling. There's an interesting quote I wanted to read on 212, and it's kind of about this women in America. It's in the middle of the second paragraph. It says, hence, it is the women, hence it is that the women of America, who often exhibit a masculine strength of understanding and a manly energy, generally preserve great delicacy of personal appearance and always retain the manners of women, although they sometimes show that they have the hearts and minds of men.
Mhm.
And he characterizes that as unique to the American woman. I think that's a wonderful quote.
Yeah. Tom, what were you going to say?
Well, it seems to me that that he's way ahead of his time, and that he's really contributing to the development of what we value presently. And yes, we are still struggling with it, but then we're still struggling with any kind of generalization from the to the individual.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we just haven't figured that out yet. But it seems to me that we shouldn't judge ourselves too harshly in terms of how that evolves, because it is a kind of evolutionary thing. It doesn't just have one day the light comes on and it all changes and now we've got it sorted and figured and we know just how to do it. It's rather that we recognize that, gosh, that doesn't make any sense. Women can't vote. How is that gonna, but it seems to me his point, as Karl was saying, is that once you take equality as the basis of the society, then you put yourself in motion toward feeling some sense. You got to figure these things out. You can't just keep doing it this other way and not come to terms with, well, wait a minute, that doesn't really add.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and that has some relation to something that's been at the back of my mind through all of this. Is that in 1840, women still did not have the vote,
right?
And also black people didn't have the vote.
Right.
So, as far as equality is concerned, it was the equality, the standard against which equality was measured would be the standard of the white male, So the fact that he said some of these women have the hearts and minds of men was really striking. It's like, gosh, they're as good as men. So the standard of equality is at that point, and it needed to evolve, was different than today.
Yeah, for sure.
I think he was seeing initiative on the part of women in America. Being a younger country, women did have to take more initiative. Their roles were not as clearly defined. It may look like it was clearly defined because they didn't have voting rights and they couldn't own property, but they still could express themselves and show much more initiative than in Europe, because things were not set and there was a burden on the women for their share of labor.
Right, but I guess what I'm saying is that initiative and all of these other qualities are defined as male.
Oh yeah.
That's what struck me,
Yeah.
So.
Well, even your point, like if his point is, he would say women aren't. If you talk about the division of labor, he would say being politically interested is not the realm of women. That's what he says, and so we know, as you pointed out, that's the evolution, right? That's what had to evolve, is they, having an appetite or a strong heart and a strong mind. It inclines some of both genders to be interested in politics.
Yeah.
He wasn't there yet.
Right.
Go ahead. A society that holds equality as a fundamental tenet, as this is how it ought to be. Without that benefit, we wouldn't be talking about it.
Right.
True.
And as long as we all share that tenet, and it's strongly adopted by the majority. In fact, the majority wouldn't have any power if we didn't believe all men are created equal. See, there wouldn't be a majority if there were no principle of equality. We wouldn't believe in it. Yep. So we believe in that. And so when we see vestiges of inequality, it seems to me, and it's not just because Tocqueville says it, because it seems to be the case. When there are vestiges of inequality, we root them out. Mm-hmm. We expose them. Freedom of the press and in the courts. Mm-hmm. And women organized in the 1830s and 40s exactly for the right to vote. And they were free to do that. and they gain respect over time. So it happened eventually. So there's that tenet of equality that once admitted as the basis of justice, and divinely ordained justice, by the way, then we can't deny it. If we do so, then we're definitely not on the side of the angels.
Yeah.
And we're not on the side of history, as some later day philosophers would say.
Mm-hmm.
We're not on the right side of history, excuse me.
And I think he points out that idea of equality took root in civil society before it even entered political life.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I think the education piece is critical, as Ray was saying.
Just to contrast, what I was struck by, and I hadn't thought about it quite, and it's been a long time since I read this chapter on the sexes, but I guess I was thinking the way that he describes aristocracy, where you would say, well, you have clear relationships to people who are above you and below you, and you have family connections that you can call on, so you're connected in all these ways, and your role is set in a more defined way. That usually when we think of aristocracy, we're kind of distasteful about it. But then I thought, okay, well, you kind of know where you belong, you know who you could count on, all that kind of stuff. And if it's divine sort of in the background, you've got that. But then I was thinking what happens in equality is that everybody has to take care of themselves. You have the society that you're going to call on, but you can't oblige anybody to help you. And so you have to help yourself. And so it seems to me, as a father of daughters, and many of us are, that you would say, I want to equip my daughter to exist in this equality. That means she's got to be educated. She's got to know how people work, how to protect yourself, how to work. And so it's, in a way, equality brings the principle of it, but it also forces how to get somebody to be successful in it. That's what I thought the chapter was trying to say also.
I want to segue from the sexes, but it's related. Since I was teaching in the 70s, teaching Tocqueville in the 70s, as a matter of fact, and I got to this chapter on practical sciences, how we are addicted to the practical sciences. And we discussed, among many things at that time, how the sciences had, in fact, contributed to women's equality, the women's rights movement. And one could speculate about that. But anyway, what about this chapter on the addiction to practical science? Did you find that dated, or did you find that something that we could say, yeah, I understand how that's the feature of practical science we'd call it technology, I think, these days.
Yeah.
Having a higher, we talk about people studying in order to be something. We don't talk about them studying necessarily to learn for its own sake, but in order to be something. And those who are in the STEM vocations seem to be getting more of a play these days. So what do you all make of the addiction to practical science?
I read it, and one of the first things that came to mind is I'm so grateful that I'm not doing practical stuff right now, that I'm in retirement doing philosophical stuff with Andy and his group. And it's what I find is solely missing and really sadly missing in education these days, that so much of it feels utilitarian. So much of it feels, you do this to get this, to get this, to get out, and then get that job that is, and I think back on the fact that I was a philosophy and politics student, and sure enough, I went into a career that was educational technology, and I kind of stumbled into it, but the bottom line was, when I went into it, it was not about what it was going to serve me, but that practical side. And now in retirement, I'm able to kind of pursue some of these things that are back to these philosophical ideas, and I'm grateful for it. And I think in some ways, I'm sad to see that it is not part. I kind of resisted Tocqueville a little bit, saying this is what America is all about, this kind of, practical. And I get it, but at the same time, I think it's also one of these things that I resist, because I think it's important to have some of that background understanding of philosophy and some of the background theory behind some of these, rather than, I see kids today who are very adept at technology, but trying to get them to explain it in an underlying foundational way, they oftentimes can't do it. They can do it by rote, they do it just by, but getting them to then teach it, or getting them to understand those kind of big picture background pieces about it, I think they're lacking in some of those. So anyway, I have to go up on.
But isn't that sort of the fault of that we live in such a materialistic times in a society where it's all about doing better and having more, and so we leave out the more important things, how to be a human being. What does it mean to be a human being?
Yeah,
I think part of it, though, is going back to the practical science as opposed to basic science. You could make $1 out of practical science, basically engineering, technology, and people did. There was lots of invention in the United States in the 19th century. There was science too, but science was either something that rich men funded or the government funded. And the government didn't fund much science.
Yeah.
And the change really is 20th century, long after de Tocqueville, when it became obvious that to stay ahead, you had to do some of the basic science too. So I think it's what de Tocqueville is looking at in the 1830s is still with us. It's just that that next step into science, impractical science, so to speak, where basic science has become a little bit more practical, something like that. So I think that attitude still maintains.
But he doesn't see, Tocqueville doesn't think that that's a good thing necessarily for theoretical science to be put aside. In fact, he says something the opposite about what needs to happen in the case of theoretical science. Somebody have that quote handy?
Well, he's showing how like on page 47, the Chinese didn't have the power of changing. They got too practical. So that's a caution for us.
Well, and that I saw that quote, Andy,
yeah.
And that's where I say, we're having big arguments now with the Chinese over our intellectual properties. Mm-hmm. And one of the issues is, have they lost their ability to be inventive and creative?
Yeah. It's page 46, the last full paragraph. If those who are called upon to guide the nations of our time clearly discerned from afar off these new tendencies, which will soon be irresistible, they will understand that possessing education and freedom, men living in democratic ages cannot fail to improve the industrial part of science, and that henceforward all of the efforts of the constituted authorities ought to be directed to support the highest branches of learning and to foster the noble passion for science itself.
And I think that was happening.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Read on there, the next line. In the present age, the human mind must be coerced.
Yeah.
Theoretical studies.
That's right.
Its own accord to practical applications.
For all the reasons we've just said, right? Which is, it's useful, it's profitable.
It's interesting. I lived during a period of time when I saw that transition. Where people were more and more inclined towards what's in it for me in studying, the decline of the liberal arts, or even whole departments being unfunded. So everything now, it seems to be about how much of an income can I expect if I take this major. So it's gotten to an extreme now. Yeah. So theoretical science is indeed almost, people do have to be coerced into that, really.
Well, they'd have to be given an incentive. We might say coercion in a sense would be, if we want to talk about it in democratic terms, they need to be given an incentive
A grant.
Theoretical stuff.
Incentive, exactly. I didn't mean, like, like a law or something. But
So
but I've known teachers. I mean, teachers in the liberal arts who are, they can't make a living because it's all been completely ground down by this impulse to make everything practical.
So I guess I'm not clear on what he's saying in this chapter about addiction to practical science. I think I get that he's saying Americans tend to be very, very practical, and that they want to think in terms not of the theoretical distinctions, but rather what does the science take us to that we can do differently in practical terms. And we can see pragmatism, American pragmatism, coming out of that. And we've read some of that recently. Many of you were in those seminars. But is that all he's saying, or is there more? Is there another aspect? I mean, does he give us any redeeming value in our relationship to science, or is it simply that we're too practical?
Yeah, is this a warning, Karl? Is he? I get to Tom's point that we were in a time in America, and I think Francine brought this up, where invention and the reality of the need every day of trying to come up with new and better ways to do things amidst the wilderness, amidst the frontier, were absolutely critical to the survival of America in a lot of ways. But is he also warning us that in pursuing these practical ways of looking at science, that we are going to miss out on the theoretical, or are we going to kind of miss that whole fundamental underlying foundation that really can help guide us? I'm not sure that I understood that yet.
Well, I think there's a theme here, not that Trent is going back to Tom's point. I think there's a theme here that he's pointing to, which is there are things that are higher than man, or there are things that are higher than the practical affairs of life that we need to be concerned with if we're to live a good life. I think that's what he's pointing to in a number of different ways. And one way that has implications for politics. If you have people who run for politics, political office, who don't know anything more than the practical, for instance, they may not be able to understand science when they have to deal with it, for instance. So I think it's a theme, and there's a number of different places where he gives us those examples. But in this particular one, Tom, since you raised it, the middle of page 46, he says, I believe, moreover, in high scientific vocations. He says, nor is it credible that among a great multitude of speculative genius should not from time to time arise inflamed by the love of truth alone. So I think what he's pointing to there is sort of a trade-off. If we say that all we're going to encourage our young people to do is pursue the practical science, we may leave those who have got more capability or more passion for those things that are higher. And at various places, Tocqueville talks about those things that are higher. And that's why past physical well-being, for instance, he talks about in religion that there's more to Christianity than simply saying, I want to do the good, I want to do the right thing so I get into heaven. There's more to Christianity than that. So I think he keeps pointing us to those things that are higher.
I found a quote. It's in his chapter on ambition, page 245. It's like the third.
Yeah, that's a good one.
He says, a man who raises himself by degrees to wealth and power contracts, in the course of this protracted labor, habits of prudence and restraint, which he cannot afterwards shake off. A man cannot gradually enlarge his mind as he does his house.
Yeah.
He also made a point, though, that if you don't have an aristocracy to dictate your affairs, you can't possibly keep up with everything and be an expert on everything. So you have to choose what are the things that you're passionate about that you're really going to go into deeply, and what are the things that you're going to just take on the majority's opinion or however else you can figure it out, because you can't know everything about everything.
But to that point, in European society, the philosopher is much more respected than he is in American society. I mean, I have family in Europe, and the kids that are the same age as my son, I mean, they just speak with fluidity about, philosophy. And fortunately, my son does too, so he can speak that language. I'm lost. But, I mean, it's just kind of a way of being in Europe.
No, in fact, to your point, like if you said, oh, my kid's studying philosophy in college, they would say, wow, I can't think of a better waste of time and money in America.
Yeah.
They can pay back their loans.
Yeah, there's no respect for that kind of thing here.
Yeah.
It's definitely better balanced than here, education.
Can I just speak for America for 1 second, though? I guess what I would say is on page 45, just to make the point that we're making right in the middle of the page, in aristocratic ages, science is more particularly called upon to furnish gratification to the mind, in democracies to the body. That's the point we're all making. And then it's the last full paragraph, there's a line. These very Americans who have not discovered one of the general laws of mechanics, and this is obviously, as Dave pointed out correctly, this is before we started becoming more invested in theoretical science, have introduced into navigation an instrument that changes the aspect of the world. So I guess one thing I have to admit, I'm proud of America for this, which is we will delve into the practicalities of a science and dig and dig and dig until we can find the best engine we could possibly make, and then figure out how to mass produce it. And that's what turned us into the leader of the world, right? It's our size and our scope and our inventiveness, I guess.
To that point, Andy, one of the things I thought was a fascinating conversation is when de Tocqueville asked it was a seaman, a guy who was on a ship, why they are not making ships that last longer.
Right.
And I can't find the quote, but I do remember him saying, well, why would we do that? We're finding new ways to sail every day. We're finding new navigation methods. And if we made a ship that lasted forever, we would never be able to avail ourselves of that new technology or that new science, new discovery. And I thought, I had never considered it that way. I'm always looking for a car that'll last me 30 years.
Right.
When the United States Naval Observatory was founded, I can't remember, I think about 1826, it was pointed out that it could do both things. On the one hand, it could actually study the stars, the science, but perhaps more practically, it could improve navigation methods and establish true time. It was going for both sides, and that was a military funding source.
Interesting.
But Dave, your point, I thought, tell me if I didn't get you right, that we basically our society then has to decide, since we have to focus, we've learned we have to also focus on theoretical science, that it's the government and places like that have to fund that, right?
The original funding for a long time of most science was either rich people or the government. And in the early 20th century, they started funding it by companies, simply because they realized basic science is practical. They can make a buck out of basic science. So I think on the one hand, we got into higher levels of science, but on the other hand, we're still in that de Tocqueville model of,
for the same reason.
Can I make a buck?
Okay.
So Andy, it seems to me that one place where this distinction between the practical and the philosophic shows up in American life that might be instructive and that is related to Tocqueville is in the shift from political philosophy to political science. So we no longer have political philosophy, except in philosophy departments that are thought of as abstract, and over there someplace in this kind of weird, crazy, abstract, non-important stuff. Rather, we've developed political science. So we do surveys and polls and all of that. It seems to me there really is some value, some deep, important value to political philosophy, meaning trying to understand what political system is the best one and why, and how that all works, and what the history of that has been, and what we've learned along the way, and so on. Not in the practical political science sense, but in the philosophic sense.
Well, the founders working with political philosophy. So,
Mm-hmm.
so that was very important in the 18th century.
But I guess I'm trying to understand what you're saying. I agree. The founding fathers, I mean, in the Declaration, that's political philosophy for sure. But would you say, if you want to say, well, let's look at political philosophy, still you would want to ask, well, what's our criteria for deciding what's best? Right? Then it gets very philosophical, right? Because then we say, well, what's the best for mankind? And that's kind of what you're trying to get at, Tom? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I'm saying I think that the important questions are what system, what organization of society, and what organization of power, what distribution, who gets this, all that whole thing is appropriate for people to wonder about and explore and
I agree.
work on, and that we've made a huge step forward in our system, but it ain't perfect, and certainly there's the distinction between how we've conceived it and then what's actually happening in the world.
Right.
It's arguable that the underlying philosophic foundations are getting lost in the process somehow.
Yeah.
I agree.
So it seems to me all of it is valuable stuff for us to work on, but we're not working on it. We're working on political science, which is interpreted as how do you get elected and how do the polls work, all that stuff.
Yeah. So Tom, I was caught in between that change between political science and political philosophy in graduate school. So I had to do a master's thesis on the logic of survey analysis, for instance. But what I was going to suggest, because in going back to Tocqueville, he talks about the importance of the judicial power. So if you think about it, one place where political philosophy might show itself to be most valuable in legal education would be in the education of judges or potential judges, not guardians. He makes that distinction, right, about guardians, but how we educate judges. And then also people who are schooled in political philosophy might be great opinion writers in various papers, right? Freedom of the press. So I think Tocqueville is on behalf of America, I could say, I think he was right in pointing to the freedom of the press and the judicial power as being places where there might be, and then now linking that up to what you're saying, political philosophy does have a role, I think, in helping us figure out what is justice in terms of who makes a good judge and being practical. Who would make a good judge? Not necessarily, are they this gender or that political bent or another political bent, but actually reading their opinions and see what the quality of their thinking is. So that might be, I'm just trying to take something that you suggested, political philosophy, and saying that's where we might see an actual usefulness, utility for political philosophy would be in judges.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, with constitutional law, you certainly want to see if they understand what the underlying philosophy was in the Constitution and political foundation of this country. Absolutely.
And just, I'm going to make an appeal to Aristotle here. If you want to look up, one of the things that judges need to be good at, as we all should be good at in our lives, is being equitable. And you can look up what that means in Aristotle. But in a nutshell, it means to be a good judge means to be able to apply principles of law, even natural law, to specific circumstances. And that seems to me to go past.
Do you think Tocqueville would say that we, because we're so practical, that the reason we've given up political philosophy, or the reason that judges might not be as well trained in principles as we might want them to be, is that, in other words, has our emphasis on the practical taken us so far away from principles? Is that, you think Tocqueville would say that?
Yeah, that's what I think he's getting at.
Another division of political philosophy, political science, is public policy, how to get from point A to point B.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting that we talk about science policy, but we also talk about policy for science, science for policy. So the great movement for studying physics in the United States that started in the 40s and really lasted for the next 30 or 40 years was so we could build nuclear weapons. It really wasn't to understand the basic principles of physics. It was to build weapons.
Yeah.
Well, I think we also, I mean, I think Paula brought this up before, but when we talk about the founders and the fact that so many of the founders did have a basis in philosophy and political philosophy, I think they were able to build a constitution that then had practical application. So how do you turn something that is philosophical and theoretical into something that is practical? And whether that's the separation of powers, the number of legislators, the way things are divvied up, I think there is a scientific application of that philosophy in the way the Constitution was formed.
Hey, Karl, if it's okay, I would like to take us to page 124 and just read that last paragraph. It's the end of chapter 8. It's the end of the chapter, self-interest rightly understood. Because it seems to me it's what we're getting at.
Yeah.
So I'll read the whole paragraph if that's okay. I do not think that the system of self-interest as it is professed in America is in all its parts self-evident, but it contains a great number of truths so evident that men, if they are only educated, cannot fail to see them. Educate then at any rate, for the age of implicit self-sacrifice and instinctive virtues is already flitting far away from us, and the time is fast approaching when freedom, public peace, and social order itself will not be able to exist without education. And I know we touched on this before, but it seems to me we're right in the middle of it, which is the system we're talking about, even the practicality versus the theoretical, it's only going to work if we have educated people, and not just educated in practicality.
So a question there in theoretical terms would be in terms of logic, for instance. What does he mean, or what do we understand to be what's something being self-evident?
Right.
When he talks about self-interest rightly understood, how can you decide what is rightly understood if you don't have the underpinnings of a little bit of philosophy and ethics and not just
you're right.
practical?
I think that must be true.
That's where we've gone astray.
We're getting near to the end of our time together, but therefore I wanted to segue to, since someone did talk about the Constitution in there, I'm wondering, in the last book, he talks about the centralization of power, and my question would be to the group would be, do you think that what he talks about forms being those intermediate concepts, at least, would it also include the Constitution? So, point being, if the majority is desperate enough for their physical security in light of things that we might say like natural disasters or pandemics, would the majority support, in that case, just putting the Constitution aside?
Yeah.
Well, we did it in 9/11 with the Patriot Act. I mean, in some ways that was kind of the point behind the Patriot, giving up some liberties in order to have greater security. And that's, I think people have pointed to China in this regard and said, okay, well, we've got a bad situation. Let's lock everybody down. It hasn't completely worked in the US. Take a look at Florida, but spring break is still going on in some of those places. But it's a great question. It's one of those things where, depending on the situation, I think people are willing to give up some of those things if in fact it means the greater good.
So is the Constitution one of those forms that might get in the way of the majority's desire for physical well-being, taking precedence over their love of freedom?
Yeah. I think that's all a matter of interpretation, because I just saw a news headline today that Trump is considering quarantining people in their homes like China did. So that would possibly be something that a court or something might rule on. as to whether he can do that. You know, our Constitution is so, you know, broadly written and constantly subject to interpretation. It gives it, you know, it could go either way.
Seems to me it's just a huge problem because as the world changes, and it's changing a lot and fast, the mechanisms that worked at one point come into question, in my mind, at another. So freedom of the press, for example, seems to me to be a real threat in the world that we live in that so much misinformation can be gotten out to so many people so fast and so effectively, and even in institutionalized forms.
I thought that point about the press on the bottom of page 324, I read what he wrote about that press and felt nostalgic. Bottom of 324 in the middle of the last paragraph, he says, at present time, an oppressed member of the community has only one method of self-defense. It may appeal to the whole nation, and if the whole nation is deaf to his complaint, it may appeal to mankind. The only means he has of making this appeal is by the press. Thus, the liberty of the press is infinitely more valuable among democratic nations than among all others. It is the only cure for the evils that equality may produce.
Yeah.
Before the internet.
And I was just thinking to myself, wow, how many people of many generations, but particularly the younger generations, just would look at that and say, what does that mean? And it's fundamental to our Constitution, of course, the Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights. So,
yeah.
But that's the education. It goes back in a way. Let's just say with social media being out there, as Tom suggested, and freedom of press, we can have a lot of things out there, but then people have to be educated or understand well enough what passes for truth in some cases ought to be seen as fake news in others. So the critical nature of philosophy and logic would be to suggest there's got to be something fundamental about being able to discern the truth from falsehood. And that's part of education.
Tocqueville actually several times says there's a segment of the population that prefers being told what to think.
Yeah.
Then they don't have to do any work. They don't have to work for it. They just accept what they're told.
I think, didn't he say that we all have that in part, right? Like there's part of us that wants to be led, and then we also want to be free. So it's a danger that we're going to have to guard against, right?
I think he says at one point that if we didn't have a certain amount of dogmatism in our thinking, that we couldn't really exist. I mean, we have to have some kind of basis for believing that what we're going to do is correct. Otherwise, every single step we would have to agonize over. So there's always these hidden assumptions that will underlie our daily life.
True.
Kind of dogmatism of what he says. I've never thought of it that way. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
But I think what really is great in democracies is that we do have some authorities, but that's based on merit. People who have actually accomplished something and brought something to the table that we can agree on. And you know, I mean, we have the experts in our society. That's of great value.
But I thought what Steve was saying earlier was that in the past, where we might have had a kind of our version of an aristocracy that was picking, let's say, our senators, or you might say that the electoral college is a kind of a version of an aristocracy in theory. We all have authority just by being citizens now, educated or not, right, to vote. So in a way, we're making decisions without any merit, potentially.
Right.
Yeah. I see your point though too.
So the question of this centralization of power, I think, is pretty much dominates the last part of the book. Yeah. My question for you is, how do you think what he says in the final chapters depends upon what he said previously, or do you see it as sort of a separate argument? You see that everything he was saying is leading to the centralization of power, or do you think that he just had an axe to grind?
Well, I thought he was trying to make it's a logical case, not at least in my view, not just an axe to grind, but I could be wrong. But it's because what you're looking for, different than the aristocracy, where you have all kinds of modes happening all over the place and there's no uniformity. What you have to have in equality is uniformity. And so that requires some centralization. But I thought he was at least trying to advocate, well, you could have a county, you could have a kind of a guild, you could have a group of interested people as a kind of a version of an aristocracy to counter the centralization. But I thought he was making the case, if you have equality, you have to have centralization. But maybe I got that wrong.
My reading of that was that even though there is centralization, even though there is a body of law, that so much of what I thought what he kept tying back is the idea that if we do education via practical participation in local government, that we all have ways to interpret some of that centralized mode. So there may be a law that is passed down from the Supreme Court, but the enactment of that law is going to have a tie-in to how we deal with things on the local level. There is the application of how you put a law into practice in Ojai as opposed to how it's put into practice in another town. And so I think my understanding of his view of education was the involvement of the local people is going to have so much to do with how we educate in democracy, how we actually get involved. And I think he's encouraging that all along. So even though there's the centralization, I think he also believes that it's how that centralization is applied locally that's going to really make the difference.
Interesting, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just thought the centralization chapters lack one very fundamental entity he overlooked, and that's the states. Yeah. He seems to talk about the centralization of power as being the national or federal government. Yeah. And he doesn't seem to give any cognizance, at least in this volume and these chapters, to the states. But that's what, Steve, that's where I think that's a part of your argument would be where the people have more control would be locally and at the state level than nationally. And that might go back to the genius of the founders, understanding that.
Yeah.
That's one of the checks on the federal government, national government, in fact, is the fact that people can act through their states and locally.
He may not be explicit in that, but that was the underlying.
Yeah, I think that makes some sense.
Well, I thought he was saying that at least in part. Again, not using the word state. He talks about
provinces and counties. He doesn't use the word states, but I think the principle
counties
is there.
Yeah, I thought so too. And I even thought it got smaller too. Like he on 324, he was talking about that you can create an analog to the aristocracy by artificial means, like private citizens combining together and so on.
You know, Karl, maybe you know more. I honestly don't know the details of how he discerned this. I think it'd be fascinating to really understand. Was he sitting in little council meetings down in local places? Was he going up to? I mean, I'm still so fascinated by how did he glean all of this information? I mean, for 10 months in the U.S. was not a lot of time to really be kind of gathering all this information. So I'm curious. Do you know more about that?
Well, there are books written about his travels and how he did it, but he didn't do it through surveys or focus groups. Let's put it that way. But I had one last thing, and I appreciate this, the question, Steve, but I had one last point that I wanted to bring us to. I don't know if anybody reads appendices or footnotes, but on page 368, and this is goes back to what's on bottom of page 321. It points us to this particular appendix, and I wondered if anybody read it. Because he seems to be getting at, so let's just say, Steve, to your point about local government, right? Look on 368 Appendix BB. it cannot be absolutely or generally affirmed that the greatest danger of the present age is license or tyranny, anarchy or despotism. Both are equally to be feared, and one may proceed as easily as the other from one and the same cause, namely that general apathy, which is the consequence of individualism.
Mm-hmm.
The proper object, he says, therefore, of our most strenuous resistance is far less either anarchy or despotism than that apathy which may almost indifferently beget the one or the other. Now, to me, that's a pretty powerful statement about what we have in our control, right? So we might think of, well, God's ordained this and we can't resist it. But here, right at the very end, he seems to be pointing to something that might be within our control and even in our own souls.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
I think of the few people that 40% of people don't vote. I mean, that's really apathy for sure. So I think he is anticipating that apathy, if people don't become involved in education and they're not active in politics, if they're just apathetic, then if 40% don't vote, then something can happen that's very that brings out all of these problems that he's discussing, such as despotism.
Yeah, there was just, to that point, there was just a recent article in the New Yorker by Jill Lepore, who talked about, the 30s and the rise of populism in the 30s and authoritarian governments. And so often she talks about the fact that so much of this was because of perhaps chaos and because of uncertainties in society. There is a tendency for the population to vote for authoritarian, leaders, and hence Trump. I mean, in some ways, there is this. That she points to that. She points to some of the other things that happened in the 30s as well. But there is this tendency to kind of just give up all of your ability to be involved because of the chaos around us. And I think there is that we have to be guarded against the tendency.
Tocqueville does talk about how easily we can, excuse me, we can lose our liberty and freedom, but that we're able to actually accept servitude as long as there's equality.
Right.
There's a quote on 293 that really struck me. Private life in democratic times is so busy, so excited, so full of wishes or work, that hardly any energy or leisure remains to each individual for public life.
Right.
And
Totally.
we're in a consumer society. Our focus is on sports teams.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things to distract us from public life and our responsibilities as citizens.
So I was just going to say, Steve, to me, the best way to combat apathy, voting would be one of those things, but also being involved locally in matters that involve, I don't know, might that apply to Ojai in any way when it comes to water?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
For sure. There's a bunch of issues.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what I love about the public spiritedness of that place, which is why Ray and I like to go back there and drink from the springs of your public spiritedness.
Well, we hope there will be a time very soon when you can come back and visit for everyone's sake.
We do indeed.
Yeah.
I have 3 minutes on a different topic.
Go.
Sure.
So the world is turning to internet-based communications out of necessity. And we doing these kinds of seminars are also doing that. Thomas Aquinas College, for example, and St. John's College are both completing the remainder of their semesters with online seminars of this kind, which is their primary mode of instruction. I mean, it's not something they do on the side. It's the center of the curriculum that they have these kinds of seminars. So they're now trying to do them using the tools that we're using right now today. And so many of us related to those colleges and to this Agora and Chautauqua Foundation program are really interested in to what extent can we make this work, and what do we have to do differently, if anything, to make it work. So this is the first of these kinds of events. And I'm just very interested in your impressions, not now. I mean, it could be now if you want, but later might be better after you've had a chance to kind of think about how did this seminar go, and how enjoyable was it? How much did you learn? How is it different from others that you have been to in person? And then most importantly, could we have structured things different in any way that would have made it, made the adaptation or the adaptation from being in person to being online, made that any better? And so it may be the case that this mode will work, but that we have to adapt it in some ways. Or I don't know that. Maybe not. Maybe this is just perfectly fine. I certainly enjoyed our discussion today, and I feel like I got something out of it. And I feel like the amount of presence that was here was close to what it is in the room. Wasn't identical. For me, it isn't identical, but it's of the same kind. I mean, there is a kind of group spirit and a kind of group communication that is the thing we all value. I mean, it's the reason we do this, at least in part. It's a way of learning that's different. But it's not clear to me if there isn't technique involved that we need to learn in order to make the most of it. So I would just like your feedback on that.
Well, I really miss our discussions, on the foundations of the Republic. And I would like to try, I don't know that this is I think we need to try some more to see what else is happening. But I would like to see us start again our 1-hour discussions on the foundations and even our Greek and Chinese philosophies. I think the 1 hour would be nice to try.
Sure.
Yeah, I second that. And I think I sent Andy an email. I've been saying this to a lot of people. I would love to have a discussion about what we're watching unfold with this infectious disease issue and the role of the federal, state, and local governments. I think it's been fascinating to just watch that in action. And it would be interesting to me to have a group of people, where we sort of kick around what we're watching and seeing and how that relates to what we've read, in foundations.
Tom, I'm first of all, I've really missed our classes, and I'm so glad that we had an opportunity today to invite and bring Karl and Ray in from afar and be part of this. I have a family that is stretched out all across the country. I have 8 siblings, and we have been doing this really every 2 weeks, getting together through this with my dad, who's 90 years old, and it is a gift to have that. There are always protocols and etiquette and all kinds of things that can be improved while you're doing this, Tom. And I had a couple people on my staff when I was at the County Office of Education who were pros in doing virtual learning. And they really were good at setting up curriculum and knowing how to make it more interactive. There is a role for a facilitator. Andy always does a great job, but trying to kind of fine tune that in this environment is a different thing. So I think the more we can teach each other about the tools that can be used, how some cases sharing a desktop may be an advantage, some cases sharing materials virtually can also be helpful. So I'd be happy to kind of chime in on some ideas as I think through this, but I'm very grateful that we have an opportunity to do this again. So I think it's great.
I'd love to email everybody and then write back and whatever you think, whatever occurs to you later. And we'll pick up the foundations again too. I would be happy. I miss it too. It'd be great to go back to it.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful that you organize this online, because I really love getting together, and I like getting together personally, but this is the closest thing right now, and I think there is great purpose in this, because there are times when people are far away or they can't come physically, and so it's nice to be able to enable people who might be disabled or maybe far away to be able to do it this way, to join us this way. But for our first try doing this, I think it was very good, and I was really glad, frankly, to get my mind off of the tragedies that are taking place right now, the losses, the deaths. And it's important for us to be involved in subjects like this. So I'm just really grateful to Karl, Andy, Tom for making all this possible. And I thought that you did very well by giving us 3 topics to focus on as we were reading. I thought that was very good. It sort of connected everything. So those 3 points that you came up with, I don't think we've had them beforehand, before the seminars in the past, but I thought that was actually very good for this kind of this kind of setting. So I appreciate it very much, and especially the fact that you work so hard on these.
Well, I had a thought, Tom. First, thank you all for making this possible and inviting us to be part of it. I just had one parting thought about the people on the front lines. And we've seen soldiers in past emergencies doing the same thing, but just think about the refutation against self-interest rightly understood that's in the lives of those people that they're demonstrating to us. About what it means to be a community-spirited person who's putting literally their life on the line and sharing their expertise, and possibly, putting their family at harm as well. I just think that says something about the limits of self-interest rightly understood, and more about what it means to be a community and a country.
And to always have something higher than yourself.
Right.
In your life.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Wow. Yeah. I'll email everybody, but appreciate it.
Thank you, Andy. It was great.
Thank you. Stay well and safe.
Thank you.
Good to hear you, Adele.